You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
And as you can see, once again, we are not in our usual recording studios in inverted commas. We are still out here in the Czech Republic.
We are.
We've been doing a short series looking at anthropology in Czechia. And Todd, you have brought me out here in the second leg of the trip to the southernmost tip of the Czech Republic. We're in a town called Břeclav, which is quite close to the borders with Austria and Slovakia.
Yep.
It's fairly rural. We've moved away from Prague, from the bright lights of the city. But you've brought me out here because you've promised something quite special. So don't keep us in suspense. What can you tell us about it?
All right. Here it is. But before I get to that, don't forget to like this episode, subscribe, click the notification bell. If you're listening on some other platform, go ahead and leave us a comment or some kind of review. We appreciate all of that support. That helps our little podcast to grow. As you know, this is a very small operation. Paul and I do all the research and design of the episodes. We have staff at Core Academy that does production. All of that's very expensive. We depend on you guys to help make that happen. And as this is going out, we just finished our holiday fundraising campaign. Hopefully we had a really successful one. But I do still hope you will remember that we do have a large bill every year to produce this, and you will maybe give us a small donation. Now, this episode in particular, we have to acknowledge the generosity of the Genesis Fund, the Nehemiah Foundation, for sponsoring our trip to see Lucy's skeleton and Salam at the National Museum in Prague, and then this little side trip down here to the south. Okay, so we're in Břeclav.
Yeah.
Where are we going? Tomorrow, we're going to check out a really extraordinary landscape that was once dotted with really unusual settlements. And people who have already clicked on this, they saw it in the title. It's called Dolni-Vestonice. And I'm pretty excited to see it. So Dolni-Vestonice, here we go.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so Dolni-Vestonice, you've told me a bit about this site already, why it interests you. The story sounds really intriguing. The site was first excavated just over a century ago in 1924. And since then, there have been lots of other excavations that have gone on, lots of digging seasons and so on.
Yes.
And my understanding is that these excavations have unearthed some important Paleolithic occupation sites. So just tell us about that.
Yes. I don't want to spoil too much because obviously we'll be there tomorrow.
Be seeing it.
Yeah, it'll be pretty good. But we can at least talk about the context. So,
Sure.
You know me, Paul. I get really excited about Neanderthals and Homo erectus and Homo naledi and things like that are noticeably different from us.
Yeah.
Look at us and go, wow, look at these individuals and think that is not Homo sapiens, right?
Yeah.
But where we're going tomorrow, Dolni-Vestonice, that is a Paleolithic site that is entirely occupied by Homo sapiens. So it is not a Neanderthal site or anything else. Now, these people were therefore anatomically pretty recognizable like us.
Yeah.
But in their culture and their way of life, very different. So scientists classify these, the Dolni-Vestonice sites and other sites from the surrounding area as part of the Gravettian culture.
Okay.
And simply put, the Gravettians were mammoth hunters.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you've ever seen a Venus, statue or a sculpture or carving,
Yeah.
like the Venus of Willendorf or something like that. These are the people that made those Venuses. Yeah. We'll talk about that here shortly. Now, as part of the Paleolithic, that Stone Age, so-called Stone Age, right? So the durable tools that we find most often from there are going to be stone tools. But here at Dolni-Vestonice, we have other material as well. We have bone tools, we have carved ivory, we have even fired clay, which is going to be something of a surprise to find here in this context. So now in the larger context, then, the Gravettian is kind of a transition in Europe. So prior to this, you have much more fragmentary remains, like Neanderthal sites, places where you might have a single animal that's been butchered, so there's the animal carcass, and then there's cut bones, and then there's stone tools that have been made right there on the left there. But with the Gravettian, then, we get more deliberate burial, for example, so that whole skeletons get preserved. We also get more sort of stable, obvious places where people lived.
Right.
So we're going to watch for that as we get there as well.
Yeah.
And another big thing to watch for is the artwork. So it seems like by the time you get to the Gravettian, people are spending a lot more time just doing things for the sheer joy of doing them because they enjoy it. So here are some things that we have from the some replicas, I should say, from the site. So this is there's a carnivore tooth there that's got a whole board in it here. That's for you. Here's mine.
Oh wow,
we can be fashionable now. Paleolithic fashion.
We got lasers.
Yeah, we'll put that on there. All right, try not to bang around on your microphone. Anyway, yeah, there it is. Look at that. I'm fashionable. Yeah. So they were doing that. Now Neanderthals were doing stuff like this as well. They were also making, using predator teeth to make little baubles like this. But there were other more complicated beads. They were making ivory beads. And another piece of art that gets a lot of attention is this Venus right here. So this is the well-known Venus of Vestonice, or the Black Venus. Now, there's nothing particularly remarkable specifically about this Venus. Sort of a typical Gravettian Venus. But it's made of fired clay, which is the real surprise, which is it. Now, on the conventional calendar, fired clay does not come into play for another, 10,000 radiometric years, carbon 14 years. So the fact that you have such an early sculpture there, it's not really a carving, it's a sculpture, made of fired clay is really, really surprising, right? So the technology was known, at least to some people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there were many other animal figures that were made there. We'll talk about more of those when we get there. Some of them quite impressive and intricate sculptures. And this was long before pottery use became a thing.
Yeah.
So, and just to be clear, this is a replica. You can get them at gift shops all around here. Anyway, we're obviously not using the real thing, just in case somebody didn't understand that. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a really interesting episode. I'm sure I'm going to learn lots because I was not familiar with this site really until you sort of introduced it to me. So, yes, we're heading off there. We're going to be looking at evidence of settlement, human occupation, mammoth hunting, some pretty elaborate burials, which are going to be interesting to talk about. As you say, all of the artwork, which is fascinating. But tomorrow, our first stop is actually going to be the Archaeological Museum in the nearby village of Pavlov.
Yes.
There is a kind of Archaeopark, and there is a visitor centre, and we're going to go and have a look at that. I'm sure it'll be really interesting. And then there's a trail that you can walk. I think it's a couple of miles, 2.5 miles, something like that. So a short trail, and it actually takes you out to some of the sites where various things were discovered.
Right.
So we're going to kind of walk through those. We're going to, and it takes you through from Pavlov basically to the village of Dolni-Vestonice.
Right.
So we'll follow that trail, and talk about each site as we go.
Absolutely. And that's going to be the organization of the episode. It's literally going to be following the trail and what do we discover. And as we'll see, most of it, I believe, is agricultural. And I think they're mostly vineyards.
Yeah.
But, that's for tomorrow. Don't want to spoil too much here.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we'll just follow the trail. So if you guys want to look up the museum website, we'll include that on the show notes.
Yeah.
And you can follow along as we go on our journey. So
we'll see you tomorrow.
I guess we'll see you tomorrow.
Well, here we are in Pavlov, which is the site of Pavlov 1, which is a remarkable archaeological site where many densely packed housing shelters were discovered. Now, the excavations here took place, first of all, in the 1950s, and then there were more excavations about 10 years ago when the museum was built. And what they found, as I understand, were a series of shelters consisting of a hearth surrounded by a ring of rocks, maybe 15, 16 feet across, 5 meters, something like that. And in the hearths, there are some blocks of limestone, which were presumably used to help to sort of absorb the heat of the fire. And they found about a dozen or more of these hearths here at Pavlov. So what else can you tell us about this remarkable site, Todd?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that impresses me most about this place is the huge amount of stone tools.
Right.
Now typically, you know me, I'm a Neanderthal, Homo erectus kind of guy. I like the anatomically different, but here the stone tools are finely crafted.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. But when you look back, at say a Neanderthal butchery site or a Homo erectus butchery site, you find that the stone tools tend to be very opportunistic. They grab rocks that are available right there in the environment, and they make their stone tools right on the spot, and then they cut up the creature. So you find a butchery location, you're going to find animal bones and cut mark bones, and then you find all the different stone tools and debitage and all the flakes that came off when they were making it.
Sure.
Here it's different because the stone tools are made of a non-local flint. So I got my notes here. Okay. As usual, here's my notes. So they found 13,485 different tools.
Wow.
In the southeast sector of the site, which I think is somewhere over there.
Okay. That's amazing. It's an incredible number.
That's an incredible number. 13,485. 13,000 of them, so 97% are made from this non-local flint. And the researchers estimate that it's probably 90 miles to bring the flint from its source to where they were making tools. And they have 13,000 of these tools that they've made. So they brought a huge amount of rock, a very long distance.
That's remarkable.
So either, they're moving, seasonally from one place to another, or maybe they have already begun to have little trade routes.
Yeah.
you come here and get some mammoth jerky, move up the trail, and you get some non-local flint. Maybe that's what's going on. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading into it, my modern bias, but 90 miles seems like a long time. It's not a day trip when you're...
No, absolutely, yeah.
Another really striking thing here about Pavlov 1 is their use of Miocene fossil shells. So these are shells that they've gotten locally. There's Miocene rock. Basically, that direction is a lot of Miocene rock. And in that rock, there are these shells.
Yeah. We looked at the geological map the other day.
We did. We were trying to work out exactly what the geology was here. And basically, that half of the reservoir is Miocene over there, Miocene bedrock. And over here, it's kind of different. There's kind of a fault line that runs through here. Yeah. Anyway, Miocene shells. They were drilling holes in them to use them for decoration. Now we see that a little bit in Neanderthal, but I mean they're making hundreds of these things. So they found right here 1,000 fossil shells.
So they're using them as pendants or something?
Presumably, yeah, necklaces, string them as necklaces, or they're just stringing them off their clothes, dangling them like that. But so then the other thing that they found here that I thought was really interesting are wolf skeletons.
Wow.
Now, at some of these sites, you'll find paws, right?
Okay.
Lion paws or wolf paws. And if you've ever skinned an animal, maybe you haven't had the pleasure, but if you've ever skinned an animal, you get down to the paw and it's just a hassle. So you just sort of cut off the thing at the wrist to keep the paw attached. So it kind of makes sense that you would have just the paws hanging around.
Left over, right.
If you were using the skins for leather or whatever.
Yeah.
But here they had whole skeletons of wolves. We don't really know why. Okay. Kind of peculiar. I was looking in the museum today, and they had one of the burial spots marked, and they indicated that it was some kind of developmental abnormality with that wolf, and might have been kind of odd acting. Okay. So maybe it was an animal that was known to them. Maybe it was, beginning of domestication of roves.
Yeah,
I don't know. So, that's all in my notes for this plus. But
intriguing. Well, we've got more to see.
Yeah, we got plenty more to see.
So
we'll move on down the trail.
Move on.
All right. All right. So we're going to pause here for a moment.
Yeah.
On this lovely bench to admire the landscape. Obviously, behind us is the massive Pavlov's Hills. There's a castle up there at the top. Down below is what was the Dye River that is now a reservoir. And what's really interesting about a lot of the sites along here is that they end up settling just about 200 meters above sea level, which is about 660 feet above sea level. So but the important thing is that they're all roughly at the same elevation, right? They could settle and build their houses down by the river, but they don't. They come up here farther. I think it's probably because they're watching the wildlife go by.
Right.
I'd have to think that. Why they all end up exactly at 200, close to it, that's a good mystery. But yeah, it's a really interesting feature of the sites here at Dolni-Vestonice.
Yeah. I think what strikes me as I sort of look out at this landscape is that it's a really strategic place to be. To the west of us, which I suppose is over there, are the Alps.
Mm-hmm.
And over on the horizon in that direction, you can just about sort of see through the haze the Carpathians over to the east. And I guess we're kind of in the westernmost foothills of the Carpathians right here. The region where we find all of these settlements, that we've been talking about, is therefore in a kind of natural corridor that connects the northern and the southern parts of Central Europe.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of strategic place, and you can understand why people settled here. You can imagine there were migratory animals coming through here, and the people perhaps following them. And so it's just a really strategic place to be. You're on this elevated part of the landscape here. You've got the river down there. You can see what's coming and going. And so it kind of makes sense to me.
And there's plenty of things coming and going because of the lowland. And not only that, but when I was, we were looking at all these museums here on our trip to the Czech Republic. And one of the maps that I was looking at showed this beautiful corridor. It's not just the Alps and the Carpathian Mountains, but there's also a lot of hills in this area. And there's just a natural corridor that this site is basically sitting on the edge of.
Yeah.
So again, you have like a lowland corridor where all the wildlife would migrate through, and it's just a perfect spot.
Yeah.
It's just a really perfect spot. Well, let's journey on and see what else we can find.
Yeah, let's do that. So, we're here.
We're here.
This is Dolni-Vestonice 1.
Number one.
The site of the original excavations way back in 1924.
That's about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, people were finding things here before that, a long time before that.
That's for sure.
Maybe 200 years ago,
Yeah.
People were making discoveries here. Back in 1785, there was a guy called Johann Lamb
Okay.
who was digging out a new cellar down in Pavlov village, and he excavated some bones that turned out to be elephant bones, presumably mammoth.
Presumably mammoth, yeah.
Presumably mammoth. And once modern excavations then got underway here, they discovered a mammoth bone pit. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Yeah, boy, did they ever. So the mammoth bone pit, it's about, 150 square meters, which is about 1,600 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a huge density of bones in that pit. So if you count them by the teeth, individual duplicated teeth, you get about 80 mammoths.
Wow.
In that small area.
Yeah,
and if you go by the actual bones themselves, there's about 40 mammoths. Either way, it's a lot of mammoths. And if you think about it, the average American house is 1,600 square feet. So imagine, 40 to 80 mammoths all buried in that little bit of an area there.
Yeah, it's a lot of mammoths.
That's a lot of mammoths. And, I think about, like a Neanderthal butchery site or a Heidelbergensis butchery site.
Yeah.
Something old. Again, it's really very opportunistic. The skeleton is largely there. There are cut marks on the bones. There's stone tools lying around. So you can see that someone was there cutting up that carcass. But these people were killing the mammoths and then carrying parts of the carcasses, including parts of the head, back to their dwelling places. These were tough people. These are not wimpy people. These are strong people. So, and I imagine you'd have to be to bring down a mammoth. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic thing.
Absolutely.
Now, they also used mammoth ivory to make various items. There's quite a lot of mammoth ivory artifacts that have been found in this area. Maybe the most famous is a portrait of a woman. You've seen it in museums multiple times. I had to do that little tiny little portrait.
Indeed.
Sort of an asymmetric face.
Yeah.
Now I'm told, I don't know because I've never tried it, but I'm told that, working with ivory is a difficult thing to do. It's kind of hard to work with. So the idea that these individuals were able to, use ivory to carve such intricate portraits is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Any way you look at it.
Yeah. Now, you also showed me that little Venus sculpture. Have you got?
I have one
a replica of that
right here in my pocket,
right there. Okay,
she is. Right there, she is.
Now that was found on this very site down in that lower field behind us.
Correct. Yes.
100 years ago.
100 years ago. Yeah.
And it was found in two pieces. They kind of fit back together very neatly.
That's right.
But just tell us about this Venus sculpture.
So, well, obviously, it's a really intricate sculpture.
Yeah.
It's both detailed, but also pretty stylized.
Sure.
Right. So she's got the original, let's put it that way. The original, you can see the collarbones, for example.
Yeah.
But she has no hands.
Yeah.
The feet are presumably broken off if there ever were any. Her face is largely just those little slits for eyes there. Other than that, not much to it.
Yeah.
Now, there's also on the top of the head there are these 4 openings, these 4 little holes, which we don't know what they were for.
We don't know what that, yeah.
It's possible that she was intended to be embellished. Mm-hmm. It's possible that the sculpture here was, it was like a doll and you made little clothes for her and that sort of thing. We don't really know what she was used for. Mm-hmm. Obviously, in this age, people want to imagine dramatic stories, worshiping the goddess or something like that. Yeah. Maybe not toys would be quite what they would want to think about.
Yeah.
I look at it and I think this is like, maybe this is my commercial brain here working, but it feels like trade bait to me. You want to be able to get materials that you need from other tribes around here or other settlements around here. If you had something, pretty little doll or something,
souvenirs and things,
little souvenir that you could offer to the passing tribesmen, you might be able to get something from them.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing about this, though, is that it's made of clay. The original is made of baked clay.
Yes.
Now, on the conventional calendar, which we haven't really mentioned much, but on the conventional calendar, it would be another 10,000 years before people started using clay to make containers.
Right.
Pots and pottery and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So clearly they knew how to do this.
Yeah.
They knew how to fire clay into things. And so on this site then, in several of these sites along here, we found lots and lots of little animal figurines that are made of clay.
Yeah.
So again, this wasn't just a one-off thing that this just happens to be made of clay. It's a matter of this was a skill that they knew about.
Yeah.
And they did it.
And there's quite an industry.
Yeah, it's quite an industry. Again, feels like a souvenir shop.
Yeah. But it's interesting because it also tells you, actually, they did have time to create these things. And they weren't living such a hand-to-mouth existence. They didn't have time to be creative.
Right.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. Because you think about hunter-gatherers sort of living close to the land and sort of being, I don't know, constantly on the move to find food and resources.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, but they had time to make thousands of little clay figures.
Yeah, there are loads of them. And we noticed that, of course, in the museum. I mean, there are loads and loads of these.
Yes, they have a number of
clay sculptures, and some of them are sort of human figures, and some are animal figures, and some are sort of curious symbolic things. And, yeah, there's loads of these things. So it is quite remarkable. So yeah, sure, these people knew about how to harden clay by firing it, even before they were then using that technique later on to sort of make containers and pots and all of that kind of stuff. Which is interesting because, you said they're hunter-gatherers. They're sort of moving about seasonally, perhaps following some migratory animals. And you don't want to be carrying lots of heavy stuff. Right? You don't want pots and
that makes sense.
Containers. Yeah. So it kind of fits with their lifestyle anyway. It's only when you kind of then settle down, you're living a more sedentary lifestyle that you're going to want to be making those kinds of containers and using those, pots and plates and all that kind of stuff. Anything else we should mention about this location before we move on?
There's a woman who's buried here. Yes, there's a woman who is buried here. DV3, she goes by. She was excavated in 1949. She was found basically crouched in a sort of a tight fetal position. She was laying on her right side. Her head was covered in some kind of red, probably ochre, stain. And then she was buried beneath 2 mammoth shoulder blades that appears to have been deliberately set on top of her. She had 10 fox teeth found in the sediment as well. Those fox teeth had been perforated, which is another common thing in these sites. So they were apparently little baubles that she had on her clothes or something like that. And again, this really stands out to me. I keep coming back to this because this is what I'm most familiar with. But with Neanderthals, a burial might be a body that's sort of laid out.
Right.
It's mostly there. You might have an animal bone thrown in with it that makes you think, what is this? There might be a rock that's displaced.
Yeah.
If you're lucky and people have excavated it well, there might be evidence of a pit that's been dug. But for the most part, Neanderthal burials end up being really sort of questionable, right?
Yeah.
I can understand why people would be skeptical because there's not much to it.
Right.
But with EV3 here,
it's very obvious.
She's curled up in a fetal position. She's got ochre all over her head. She's buried under two giant mammoth shoulder blades.
Yeah.
It's really stands out as kind of obvious. And so, it's an interesting contrast, I think, in sort of archaeological evidence. What convinces you that there was a deliberate burial? Well, DB3 definitely convinces you there was a deliberate burial.
Yeah. So that's Dolni-Vestonice 1.
Yep.
We should head back to the trail.
We're going
to go on to the
Dolni-Vestonice
2. Yeah, logical.
All right. Okay, here we go. All right, so we are hiking along the trail here.
Yeah. And
Dolni-Vestonice.
There's this little bluff.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of pale-coloured sediment that you can see exposed. And I thought it was worth just commenting on this because the sediment that you see here is something called loess, Loess, loess. And it's a kind of fine silt, kind of clay, it's quite crumbly. If you touch it, it'll rub off in your fingers. And it's thought to be a kind of windblown silt. It's typically associated with deglaciation, and you get these deposits, in some places, very thick deposits of loess. And the reason I just thought it was worth sort of pointing this out is because the mammoth bone pit that we saw down at Pavlov, Pavlov 1 in the museum, and many of the other sort of remains that are found in these sites are buried in this loess. They are buried in this sort of fine clay silt. So it's worth, I think, just sort of pointing that out.
Checking it out
to see what that looks like.
You can't really reach in and touch the loess at the museum. They would frown on that.
They would frown on that, yeah.
But I think it's also worth noting here that most of these sites are fairly narrow lenses. You go down, many feet, and then you find this amazing layer of deposits, discoveries, bones and artifacts and hearths. And then you go down beneath that and nothing. So there's been, a very fleeting
occupation level
there. At that one level.
There's an interesting story there.
Okay.
And, we need to think carefully about what that's telling us. There's a really interesting story, I'm sure, where you get these temporary occupation levels and then you get these deposits of the loess with nothing in them and another occupation level. So.
All right. Well, let's journey on.
Yeah, let's move on. Well, we've come now to the site of Dolni-Vestonice 2. This particular location was first discovered in the 1930s, but it wasn't excavated until about 50 years later.
Right.
And again, what was found were a series of dwellings, hearths, surrounded by rocks, rings of rocks, a bit similar to the ones that we've talked about before. But there was one particularly significant discovery that was made at this site, and I think I know something about the big story. But why don't you fill us in with some of the details and tell us about the triple burial?
Yes, the triple burial. Okay, so the triple burial, as far as I understand it. So workers in 1986 were excavating on this hill right behind us here. And they came across, at first, just 3 skulls. And as one does when one finds skulls, you sort of move down the body and see if there's anything else. And sure enough, 3 young men were laid there in a rather intentional burial. And the arrangement of the bodies is what makes it so peculiar. So the one in the middle is laid on his back. The one to his right, to our left as we look at them, is laying on his side facing the middle guy, and his hand is right over his crotch, basically. Right. It's pelvic region, if you want to be anatomical about it. And then the one to the middle person's left, to our right, observing it, that person is laying on their stomach.
Strange.
Down. Yeah.
And there was a reconstruction of that
Yes.
back at the visitor center that we saw.
And there was a reconstruction at the Anthropos Pavilion.
There was indeed, yeah.
Brno, where we stopped. So there have been several reconstructions of this. It's rather famous, and it's really a puzzling feature.
Yeah.
So genetic testing has shown now that they were all men, but they were all very young anatomically. 24 years old, 16 years old, quite young. There's evidence of like branches and sticks overlying the bodies as where they were laying, and not surprising, perforated predator teeth. Right, so apparently they had been buried in clothing or ornamentation that had these baubles hanging off them. So. Yeah, the triple burial. And again, I'm kind of impressed with the intentionality of the burial, right?
Yeah.
We may not understand exactly why these three young men are laid out that way, but there's no mistaking that they are.
It's intentional.
Intentionally buried, and not just, they didn't just fall down there and die.
No.
Let's see here. The middle one also had some kind of growth abnormality. So there was an asymmetry to his skeleton. And that led to a number of years of discussion about whether that might have been a woman in the middle. But the genetic tests seem to have indicated that they are, in fact,
it is male.
All three of them men.
Yeah.
But again, it's one of those peculiar features of this site where the Gravettian people just once in a while made these really remarkable burials. And you've got to think, you've got DV3, you've got the triple burial, you've got other individuals buried here, but, maybe a couple dozen people, maybe a dozen. And there's many more people living here, right?
Yeah.
That few people do not bring down mammoths and drag them back to their dwellings. So, so there's a lot missing, and yet, when you find something like that, it's pretty clearly intentional and pretty clearly meant something, even if you can't figure out what exactly it might have meant. Yeah,
exactly. And there's clearly some meaning to it. We just can't kind of puzzle out what that meaning is at this distance from the.
There's been lots of speculation about what it could be. But I don't really want to get into the speculation because we don't know. That's the real answer. We don't know why they're buried that way. But something was going on there. I mean, an individual with a growth abnormality and two others about the same age, all dying at the same time, getting buried so elaborately. Something was going on that was important. Yeah, even if we don't know what it was.
Yeah. Well, it's been fascinating to kind of come around on this trail and see the places where these discoveries were made. We learned about them in the museum. In the museums that we
in many museums,
and then to actually come out and see the places where these discoveries was made has been great. So
it has been.
And the weather's been very good to us, which is
it's gloomy and yet it hasn't rained.
Yes, it hasn't rained, so that's been fabulous.
No rain.
Yeah. Anyway, we should move on because the day is
wearing on, winding down. Yep. Yeah. Let's move along here.
Yeah. Well, our visit to Dolni-Vestonice has been really great. I didn't know very much about this site before I came, and I've learned a great deal. And the museum was fabulous. I mean, it was just
really beautiful.
It was really the way it was laid out was lovely.
To have the mammoth pit right there,
absolutely
in the ground where they excavated it.
Yeah, in situ. To see all of it there in place was great. So
remarkable,
really lovely museum. So if you are ever visiting Czechia, you should definitely come and check out this site. That sorry, check out this site.
it out.
I was going to say,
Check it out. Get it?
let me do that again.
No. We're going to keep that in there.
No. Anyway, so no, you should definitely come and see this.
Yeah.
It's worth seeing, and do the trail as well, and come and see the various sort of sites where the various discoveries were made. But this show is called Let's Talk Creation, and we are young age creationists.
I remember that.
And so far, we haven't really talked about that.
No.
I wanted just to, as we sort of draw to a conclusion here, to think about the creationist implications of what we've seen. How does this sort of fit into the overall creationist model? And I think I already know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway for the benefit of all of our viewers. These burials that we're seeing here of people, like the triple burial, are these people who died during the flood? The flood?
No.
Right.
Quite simply, no. The bedrock geology here is flood rock, possibly post-flood rock, depending on where you put the flood boundary. Let's not get into that whole, not that whole argument.
We've done that.
Yeah, we've done that. Go watch those episodes. We don't need to rehearse that here. But the point is, we're sitting on Miocene on this side of the hill here. The castle's right over there. You're sitting on Miocene bedrock. There's some Jurassic bedrock over there, which is definitely flood rock. The limestone that they used, the blocks of limestone that they used to line their fire pits, and the blocks of limestone that we saw they're still using to line their driveway.
They are, yeah.
As we walked up here. That limestone's Jurassic limestone. That's flood rock. Yeah. So they're using rocks from the flood to make stuff with.
Yeah.
And then the shell fossils that we talked about from Pavlov 1, those 1,000 shell fossils with the little perforations in them where they're making beads to hang on their clothes. Those are Miocene, right? So that's either flood or post-flood rock, depending on your perspective.
Yeah.
But again, that could not be something that was from during the flood. Right?
Yeah.
So, and beyond that, you have all this remarkable, beautiful detail of preservation, right? You talk about the houses, right, where you have the hearth in the middle with the heat blocks in it, and then you have the circle of rocks around it, and then you have the stone tools littering it, and then places where you find a bunch of little ceramic burned animals, that kind of detail of occupation, where you can clearly see this was an occupation site. That's not going to survive the flood.
No, it's going to be washed away.
The global flood was a tectonic event. Let me say that again very clearly. The global flood must have been a tectonic event. The only way you could flood the earth is if the mountains are lower and the sea basins are higher and more shallow. There's not enough water on the planet to flood the planet as it is. So the only way to get it to work is if you have a tectonic flood.
Exactly.
And if you have a tectonic flood of that dramatic, degree, that severity, fine little human occupations are going to get completely obliterated.
Yeah, they're not going to survive.
So these must be post-flood people.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the scale of the flood, the biblical flood, like you say, this is a global tectonic event. This is not like a river just overflowing its bang. Right. This is absolutely massive. So continents are moving around and crashing into one another, and mountains are being sort of uplifted, and there are, enormous magnitude earthquakes and all of that kind of stuff going on. So it would have just wiped out these settlements. They would have just been completely scoured from the face of the earth. They wouldn't have been preserved. So, yeah, I agree. These are not people that were living before the flood and got buried during the flood. There's got to be another sort of context. And I guess as I think about it, I would see these as post-flood people. They're, like you say, they're living and occupying these sites on top of flood rocks. They're post-flood people. They dispersed from Noah's Ark, presumably from the Tower of Babel. So just kind of unpack that story for us. How do they fit into that biblical history?
Yeah, and that's really kind of one of the big questions. And in creation studies today is how do you get human history, packed into what we understand to be the relative chronology of flood, Babel, and Abraham.
Yeah.
So these people are not using metal implements.
No.
So they're not Bronze Age, they're not Iron Age. Abraham was Bronze Age. So by the time of Abraham, he's using pottery.
Mm-hmm.
He's keeping animals
Mm-hmm.
as livestock. He understands, animal husbandry.
Yep.
And they're using metal implements, right? And so when you come here, you have very much the hunter-gatherer type people, right? And they have much simpler lifestyles. There's no pottery. They can burn. They know how to fire pottery, but they don't make it into anything useful in the sense of a pot or an implement or anything like that. They're just little figurines that they make. And it is a really interesting puzzle because, of course, if you go back further, you get far more simple hunter-gatherers. As I mentioned before, one of the big contrasts here, these people are dragging parts of the mammoth back to their dwelling, whereas earlier times you would have a mammoth killed and they would butcher it right on site.
Yeah.
And presumably haul away the meat or eat the meat there. So that was a whole different level of subsistence kind of living. So that's kind of the big question to me. Why is it when you read in the Bible, you see Abraham is quite advanced. He's got animal husbandry. He's got crops. He's got metal implements, pottery. And you read the Tower of Babel account and they're firing bricks.
Yeah.
So they're making pottery bricks basically to build their city. And then you go and you find these mammoth hunters living off the land like this.
Yeah.
And so what happened, right?
Yeah.
What happened there? And that's one of the reasons why I think, man, whatever happened at Babel, it must have been far more than just a confusion and a dispersal.
Yes.
It feels like putting both of those things together, the biblical evidence, the biblical description of the event, and then the physical evidence that we see, it seems like the Babel event must have been a much bigger shattering of culture.
Yeah. It's a huge cultural event, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a huge cultural event.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this before. We'll put those episodes, links to those episodes in the show notes. We did a little series on the Tower of Babel talking about implications.
Yeah.
But yeah, sitting here among the remains of these mammoth hunters, I'm reminded of that reality, that this is more than just people spreading out after the flood and resettling and taking their livestock with them and taking their crops with them. Something happened that certain people just lost a lot of culture in that event, and they sort of had to reinvent. Even though, we're looking around at these individuals here and there, obviously clever, they're obviously able to do many amazing things, even as we look at them and think, wow, they're living primitive lives. They're still able to make remarkable tools out of bone and ivory and
artistic representations and all kinds of things.
Beautiful enough artistic representations that you can look at it and you know what you're looking at.
Yeah.
That's the other thing that kind of blows my mind. This is not like you have to squint a certain way to see it. No, there's that one little cat, the cat head.
Oh, yeah.
You look at it and you go, that's a cat. You can see that is a cat head of some kind. Maybe a lion or something like that, but it's meant to represent a cat head. So clearly they had skill and technology of their own. It's just, it wasn't the kind of technology that Abraham would enjoy.
Yeah.
There, beginning in Genesis chapter 12. So there's something going on there, and in that space between 11 and 12, that's kind of a big deal. That little analogy there that goes from Shem to Abraham.
Yeah, indeed.
Pretty big deal that we just see almost nothing of in the actual pages of Scripture.
Yeah. And another aspect of this, which I wanted to ask you about, is how this all relates to farming. That's one of the big changes that came with the Neolithic is farming.
Yeah.
And the Gravettian people who are living here at Dolni-Vestonice, they don't have any farms. They're not farming. They're not keeping livestock. But we know Noah was a farmer.
Indeed.
Okay. So, we know that after the flood, he planted a vineyard, for example.
Like the vineyards we're sitting in.
We're surrounded by vineyards here. So Noah was able to plant vineyards. So what happened then so that these Gravettian people are not following Noah in having that farming lifestyle? They seem to have, I don't know, abandoned it, lost it. What's going on?
That is the question, right? Why does it look like farming gets rediscovered? Because as you say, the big transition for the Neolithic is, well, there's a couple of things that change at the Neolithic. You get polished stone. Mm-hmm. So you go from chipping stone to grinding at it to make it the kind of surface that you want. Yeah. You get farming, right? And the sedentary lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why that happens.
Yeah.
I don't know why there was farming and then it gets lost and then people rediscover it. Is that really what's going on? Or is it because there is a compression of time that what we're seeing are just generations? There's one generation that has it. There's a couple of generations that kind of forget about it. And then they kind of remember, it was much better when we farmed. And so they take up farming again. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe it's not really a loss and a rediscovery. But yeah, I mean, that is one of the biggest questions.
Yeah.
That creationists need to sort of wrestle with and think about.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we do have to think about that compression of timescale.
Absolutely.
Gigantic. It's a huge compression of timescale. And so we're talking about things that are happening over decades, maybe a few centuries.
Decades, a few centuries. And the conventional date here is 30,000 years.
Right.
Pottery starts at about 20,000, 18,000 years ago. So that's a lot of time.
Yeah.
You can imagine if you were living here for hundreds of years, building up, the remains of 80 mammoths in a small pit would not be that big a deal.
Yeah.
But if you're only living there, less than 50 years, that's a lot of mammoths.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we wrap up this episode, is there anything else that we need to say?
Oh, just thanks to everyone for watching. Thanks for everyone going on our adventures with us. Paul and Todd's Big Adventure. Thanks especially to the Genesis Fund at the Nehemiah Foundation for making this trip possible. It seemed like a really good idea to tack on Dolni-Vestonice onto a trip to see Lucy. So
yeah,
it was a really good deal.
Yeah.
So we're very grateful that you made that possible. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching.
Yeah.
To subscribe, like, all that jazz.
Yeah. And of course, another disclaimer just to say that the Archaeopark, of course, here at Dolni-Vestonice is not responsible for our opinions. These are our own opinions. But we are very grateful for the fabulous museum that they've provided and the trail and all of that. And it's definitely worth seeing if you do come to the Czech Republic. Do come along and see it. Yeah, that's great. Well, it's been a fabulous trip. Next time, we're going to be doing something completely different because this is the end of this short series we've done on anthropology.
Sadly, we must go back to our regular lives and our studios.
Indeed. We'll be back in our usual recording studios for something completely different next time. So check us out.
Check us in.
And you did it again. I keep doing that. You
check us out.
Yeah, anyway, well, join us next time, 2 weeks' time, for something completely different. We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.